The $12 trillion lie, why Central Asia is going silent. It's a $12 trillion exposure with a timer you can't see, counting down in centimeters on a river gauge. Maps show blue, ledgers show growth, but the basin sets the speed limit, not markets. Upstream, a single trench, Qosh Tepa, rearranges borders, budgets, and the middle corridor. Downstream, cities go quiet. Here's where it gets interesting. The water exists on paper. Live water moves on its own time. One detail will prove crucial later. Paper allocations don't lift gates in a dry week. Someone already knows it'll fail at speed. The question is why they're letting it happen and who pays first. The problem, the lie, abundance means supply. To understand the stakes, follow the money stitched to river clocks. Wheat and cotton exports priced on irrigation windows. Fertilizer and textile chains tied to pump hours and canal levels. Gas transit and power swaps leaning on reservoirs for cooling and head. River-fed terminals that make the middle corridor breathe between the Caspian, the Caucasus, and the Black Sea. Add it up and the exposure runs into the trillions, not because there isn't water, but because the promise of water has been turned into schedules. The lie is simple: abundance on maps equals deliverable supply on demand. Here's the catch. River discharge is an average, allocations are a bet. Paper water, the numbers in agreements, contracts, and dashboards, assumes rivers behave like pipes. Live water doesn't. It arrives in pulses, stalls in heat, reroutes with silt, evaporates under wind, and refuses to show up the week your crop needs it. The Aral Sea didn't dry up by accident, it was scheduled away. 5-year plans translated rivers into taps, cotton quotas bent entire basins, and maps stayed blue until ships stranded in sand. We inherited that logic, swapped the language, and kept the pace. Today's version runs faster. Basin grabs and canal digs sprint ahead of hydrology. Ungoverned intakes get treated like faucets. Promises price off annual means instead of worst weeks. Meanwhile, the hidden constraints get meaner. Timing mismatch. Peak melt now arrives earlier, brushing past planting windows. Glaciers offer a near-term bonus, bigger shoulder flows, before slipping into long-term base flow decline across the Amu Darya and Darya. Reservoirs fill with someone else's problem. Sediment shaves capacity. A hotter, windier regime lifts evaporation skin losses. Old canals widen their seepage with age. Look at the practical math. Millions across the Amu/Sa footprint depend on these rivers for drinking, irrigation, and cooling. Millions of hectares sit under rotation plans that assume mid-season releases will hold. A growing share of regional GDP is water-dependent, even when the balance sheets don't say it out loud. And the middle corridor. Those river-fed nodes care about drafts and throughput. How many centimeters of water sit under a barge? How many hours gates stay open when the upstream reservoir hedges for heat? Investors are translating all of this into clauses. Premiums, covenants, and force majeure triggers now point to gauges, not just prices. A contract that once noted delivery windows now asks for hydrology thresholds, minimum flows at a named station, salinity bands at a drain, emergency release playbooks tied to drought declarations. Markets price risk, rivers price truth. When those clash, the ledger loses. Here's where it gets concrete. The speed limit isn't mystical, it's physics and incentives. Headwater hydrology sets ceilings, seasonal peaks, sediment-rich pulses, and interannual variability that no decree can fix. Canal intakes oversized for ambition struggle in shoulder periods when the river won't cooperate. Without silt management, destiny arrives as a sandbar. Return flows come back warmer and saltier, if they return at all, pushing salinity up in fields and drains until roots fail. Every extra cubic meter, reused, without a drain budget buys a month and costs a decade. Meanwhile, the climate moves the posts. Hotter summers pull more water from every exposed surface. Wind pushes evaporation into a tax on surface area. Early melt misses seed. Late melt swamps drains. Flood, drought whiplash breaks assumptions written into allocation formulas back when ice lingered longer. Averages hide this. Catastrophic weeks decide it. On the ground, families adapt in ways spreadsheets don't. Sowing keyed to tanker arrivals when the river slips. Wells taste brackish before dashboards blink. Clinics budget saline around the truck schedule. Mid-season diesel spikes because lift pumps do the work gravity no longer does. Informal markets for valves, bearings, and nighttime water minutes appear. Schools post water days. People leave in trickles that become patterns. Zoom back out and the middle corridor feels the same pinch. Port drafts choke exports for a month. Barge loads cut. Trains idle because the river node running the crane yard went shallow and the cooling loop needed to shut. Insurance calls it a hydrology event. Traders call it a spread. Communities call it the week the birds didn't come back. The lie persists because maps stay blue longer than fields stay green and dashboards smooth lines that lives experience as cliffs. Abundance isn't speed. A river doesn't read price signals. It answers to gradients, heat, and time. The Aral's lesson sits upstream of every plan written today. Once capillaries close, they don't reopen cheaply, if at all. Subsidized denial buys months. It costs decades. So who already knows it'll fail at speed? Night shift engineers watching reservoir skin losses climb in a hot week. Agronomists reworking rotations after a missed release. Risk teams shifting covenants from price to flow. They know. And while spreadsheets argue, one new trench upstream turns the clock forward. The basin has seen the ending before. We're accelerating the opening act. First evidence, the Qosh Tepa Canal. 3 days earlier, something strange occurred along a quiet bend of the Amu Darya. A backhoe carved 1 meter too deep, hit a pocket of wetter silt, and the trench walls slumped. The foreman waved, the crew stepped back, and the river spoke. The intake lip darkened, the surface shivered, and for 20 minutes the flow into the ditch surged beyond plan. Upstream cheered. Downstream, a gauge dipped just enough to make a planner in Tashkent rewrite a week. That trench has a name now, Qosh Tepa, a unilateral upstream diversion cut through Afghanistan's arid north, positioned to intercept headwater flow before it becomes someone else's data point. On maps, it promises irrigation for hundreds of thousands of hectares. On the ground, it's an intake that can change destinies in a single dry week. There's no binding basin-wide enforcement here, no hard minimum flows with automatic penalties. The canal's reality isn't an argument, it's a valve. Why it matters is simple. Leverage lives at the head. Close your hand upstream, and downstream feels the wrist bones. In a region already running allocation routines on tolerance, Qosh Tepa inserts a new schedule nobody voted on. It's being built faster than governance can convene, faster than hydrology can be modeled honestly across seasons, faster than trust can stretch. Early signals tell you the ambition. Earthworks advancing at a pace that outstrips most bureaucracies. An intake sized for multi-season capture, not a gentle skim. Crews stacking riprap against a flow they know will try to rearrange them. Meanwhile, Uzbek and Turkmen agronomists quietly adjust planting bets, shifting rotations toward crops they can abandon late without sinking a season, while reservoir operators play tighter hedges to meet heat and power peaks. If they talk, they call it contingency. If you read their notebooks, it's worry. Here's the physics of the speed limit. Headwater hydrology sets a ceiling nobody can negotiate away. Seasonal peaks loaded with sediment, shoulder periods where water creeps instead of runs, interannual variability that laughs at 5-year plans. An oversized intake looks strong in spring. It looks hungry in August. Without relentless silt management, destiny arrives as a sandbar building exactly where the design drawings claim it won't, and return flows. If they come later, warmer and saltier, bending salinity up in drains and fields that were already on the edge. What nobody knew at the time, or chose not to emphasize, is that fast digs meet slow rivers. Capture efficiency collapses when the pulse thins. The temptation will be to chase the river down the hydrograph, cutting deeper, pulling longer, until the bank geometry and the turbidity do the rest. That's how a trench becomes a policy, not in a parliament, but in a week of heat. Follow the consequence chain. Upstream promises are loud. Hectares reclaimed from dust, yields reborn, political capital minted in green. Downstream costs are quiet. Salinization creeping through shallow groundwater, canal backflows turning drains into slow brine, fisheries stranded in channels that don't pulse when they're supposed to, a delta starved of the silt that keeps it above the wind. And across the border, volatility blooms as a management style. Emergency releases that arrive late and salty, quiet rationing designed to avoid headlines, midnight valves, that move water and blame in the same turn. Finance hears this and rewrites geography. Cotton and wheat price signals start echoing intake gauges, not just weather maps. Gas pipelines and thermal plants with cooling loops tied to river withdrawals discover that their definitions of firm capacity were optimistic. Power swaps priced in megawatts gain asterisks that reference centimeters. Insurance clauses shift. The hydrology triggers that used to be polite annexes become the paragraph a lawyer reads first. Here's the kicker: they already built the incentive for opacity. Upstream, speed wins. Downstream, transparency is protection. Between those poles, data becomes a bargaining chip. Gauge readings become, in the wrong hands, theater. The canal's real-time draw will teach everyone in the basin how honest their neighbors are prepared to be when a shoulder season runs thin. That's not a technical risk, it's political. Meanwhile, something else is happening offstage. Climate is accelerating the test. Earlier melt pulses brush past sowing dates, late pulses swamp drains, hotter wind adds an evaporation tax to every new hectare. Qosh Tepa didn't invent scarcity, it timed it. A dry August that would have been survivable becomes a crisis with a trench. A flood that might have flushed salts becomes a managed event held to protect a bank that wasn't supposed to exist. Here's where everything could turn. If metering is audited, if flow scheduling is joint and visible, if thresholds are adaptive and automatic, a new intake can live inside a basin's limits. That's the best case. In the medium case, audits weaken, salinity creeps, and conflict moves from rumor to calendar. In the worst, rapid diversion meets a thin year. The delta's capillaries pass thresholds, emergency rations roll, and capital markets mark the region down for a decade. But hold on, because the real shock started decades earlier. The basin has seen what happens when paper water outruns live water. We are replaying the opening act, just farther upstream and faster. Second evidence, the Aral Sea collapse wasn't an accident. To understand how a trench can rewrite a basin, go back to the plan that broke a sea. The Aral didn't vanish in a dust storm. It was converted into quotas, hectares, and pipes, on schedule. 5-year plans redefined rivers as delivery systems for cotton. Success wasn't mass balance, it was sown area. Hydrology became a column in a ledger that rewarded volume, not viability. Here's where it gets precise. Planners translated discharge into reachable intake, then stacked projects accordingly. The Karakum to pull the Amu sideways through desert, the Kashi to lift water over a ridge and fix it to cotton rotations. Drainage was afterthought. Salinity budgets were faith. The maps stayed blue long after channels ran shallow because the accounting system couldn't see skin losses, seepage, or salt. On the ground, the trick looked clever: pull more, plant more, report more. In practice, every extra cubic meter pushed salts closer to roots. Return flows re-entered drains warmer and saltier, raising groundwater until capillary rise delivered the brine into topsoil. Yields jumped for a season, then bent downward. Managers called it variability. Farmers called it soil death. The empty map was the tell. Charts showed a sea, harbors showed sand. Ghost ports Minak, Aralsk sat kilometers from water. Fleets stranded in place, hulls frosting into sculptures under wind. The fisheries went from tens of thousands of tons to zero. And when the shoreline retreated, the bed didn't stay quiet. It turned into a dust factory laced with salts and agrochemical residues, lifted by wind and thrown across fields and lungs. Health followed the dust. Clinics logged spikes in respiratory disease, kidney stress, and pregnancy complications. The exposed bed didn't just reflect sun, it remixed toxins. Carpets of salt settled on new plantings miles away, forcing another round of flushing that more canals couldn't afford. The bailout was always the same: borrow next year's water to rescue this year's plan. Data drew the curve. Shrinkage traced decades, not months. Salinity jumped from brackish to near brine, pushing species over thresholds. Dust storm frequency and reach climbed as the fetch lengthened and dunes formed where waves used to break. Every metric told the same story: a system pushed past a point where a wet year could repair it. Meanwhile, official charts clung to seasonal means. Averages can lie. Catastrophic weeks decide outcomes. A late release missed the breeding window for fish. A hot spell spiked evaporation across canal surfaces. A poorly timed flush sent salts back into fields during sowing. Paper water claimed everything was within bands. lived water was. Here's the line nobody likes to read out loud. Once capillaries close, they don't reopen cheaply. Channels silt, drains clog, and soils cross thresholds where gypsum and patience aren't enough. The Aral's periphery turned into a loop of false prosperity, initial gains from a big push, then creeping salinity, then heavier inputs and lower yields, then debt. Subsidized denial bought months. It cost decades. What nobody knew at the time, or wouldn't write in the file, was that the decision structure created its own trap. Targets paid bonuses. Quotas punished caution. Managers protecting a canal bank in August looked like failures. Managers who met plan with a hidden salt bill looked like heroes. The system rewarded speed against a river that required patience. Lived aftermath says more than any chart. A captain sold his boat for scrap and took a job loading sacks on a rail spur that used to ship fish. A mother wiped the white film off her well bucket and walked an extra kilometer to a tanker line that arrived on Tuesdays. A school posted wind days when the dust turned the playground into grit. They adapted around a sea that had been converted into numbers. Tie it back to now. Qosh Tepa isn't a sequel, it's a preface. The Aral showed what happens when paper water outruns live water and governance pays people to ignore physics. A trench upstream on a thinner climate clock amplifies the same failure mode. If a basin can schedule a sea away, it can schedule a delta away. The lesson isn't nostalgia. It's a warning label. Rivers remember, and they settle debts in centimeters. The human stake, lives on the dry line. At dawn, a farmer named Jamshid lifts the lid on a storage tank and listens before he looks. If he hears the hollow echo, he cancels sowing and texts 3 neighbors, "Tank a day, bring drums." His father used to time wheat to a river clock, first green when snowmelt thickened the Amu. Now Jamshid times to a driver's route and a permit that might not clear until next week. He keeps seed in sacks he can return without shame. You don't lose a season if you never open the bag. His wife Nargiza keeps a second calendar above the stove. Red dots for clinic days, blue for tanker arrivals, black for wind. On black days, their daughter's school ends at noon so families can queue. The principal posts water days with a smile that doesn't reach her eyes. Lesson plans flex around hose length. Reading becomes a monitoring shift. Cloud cover, wind, the damp mark on a pier where old people say a healthy river should reach. Wells tell you the truth first. The taste slides from cold to metallic to lightly bitter, then the tea turns a color you don't admit to guests. In Karakalpakstan, a nurse holds up a chart of kidney stress and blood pressure spikes. She rations saline around delivery windows because the tanker serves maternity first. In a dusty waiting room, a grandmother stares at a poster about hydration during heat advisories and laughs once. The advice reads like a joke to someone who knows which drum in the yard is still safe. Mid-season releases slipping by a week look small in a spreadsheet. In a field, it means diesel. Lift pumps do the work gravity won't. A microeconomy blooms, a cousin who knows which bearings last, a market for valves and hoses, a man who trades night pumping minutes behind a closed gate. Price spikes travel along irrigation ditches, twice the rate when a canal watchman whispers that the upstream gate will stay low through Friday. Everyone pretends not to know how that whisper circulates. Salinity leaves signatures in the house. Crust at the tile edge. Soap that won't lather. A patch of soil where tomatoes grew for 20 years that now kills basil in a week. Farmers test the old tricks. Deep leaching in a wet season that never arrives. Gypsum spread thin because the price doubled. Fallow strips that feel like surrender. Yields don't crash. They sag year over year until debt arrives dressed as a new pump. Identity phrase in quiet ways. A spring festival once held by a flowing canal moves to a paved courtyard where a tanker can park. Rituals that needed water become rituals about water, prayers for a delivery schedule, blessings for a spare part. At the river's edge, an old fisherman touches the dry mud where his father tied a boat. He keeps the key anyway, a metal memory on a ring that now opens nothing. Movement begins as a trickle. A nephew leaves for seasonal work on a construction crew in Astana, then extends the contract, then sends for his sister who keeps books at a warehouse. The house empties room by room. Remittances buy a new roof and a bigger tank. The tank makes staying possible and leaving easier. On wind weeks, buses run full. Children learn to read gauges. A boy brings home a school assignment, draw your favorite place. He sketches a concrete standpipe and a truck with a blue droplet on its door. His mother hangs it beside a faded photo of the Aral shoreline, a horizon of water where her uncle once stood knee-deep, smiling at a net heavy with fish. She taps both pictures as if they belong to the same story. Meanwhile, a cleric in a town near Mary changes the sermon. Stewardship becomes logistics. He asks for volunteers to paint numbered marks on bridge piers and to keep a notebook date, time, height, because paper counts better than rumor. Faith, he says, isn't a valve, but honesty can be. After prayers, men argue gently about crop choice. Cotton pays when water arrives. Wheat forgives when it doesn't. No one mentions the year both failed. This is what a basin speed limit feels like in rooms with low ceilings. Not collapse, but compression, of calendars into tanker routes, of diets into what brackish tea tolerates, of pride into the quiet skill of making do. The lie that abundance equals supply dissolves here first, in throats that burn a little and fields that glitter with
The
a
historical
salt no
route,
contract, Soviet canals, quotas, and the template. To see how today's rush learned its posture, go back to when command logic turned rivers into ledgers. Moscow didn't ask what the basin could sustain, it asked what the plan required. Cotton was currency, quotas was scripture. Hydrology became a column that managers massaged to keep numbers clean and superiors pleased. Targets paid careers. Caution cost them. Megacanals were doctrine, not projects. The Karakum cut the Amu sideways across desert, a concrete sentence that rewrote gravity. The Kashi lifted water over a ridge to fix rotations to fields that hadn't asked for them. On paper, capacities dazzled, cubic meters per second that sang in meetings. In practice, physics whispered back, seepage on sandy reaches, evaporation on hot days, silt settling where the line kinked. Drainage was the afterthought no one wanted to fund. Return flows rose warmer and saltier, quietly raising groundwater until capillary rise salted roots. Managers learned a reflex: meet the plan first, explain the river later. A district chief who protected a canal bank in August looked like a saboteur. One who delivered hectares at the cost of next year's soil was a hero. Incentives calcified into habit. You can still hear it in how people say normative in the valley, half memory, half warning. Maps did their part. Blue swathes stayed blue in atlases long after channels ran thin because reporting systems rewarded regularity. Averages hid the worst weeks. Meanwhile, engineers wrote maintenance memos that the budget filed under next quarter. Concrete cracked under thermal swing, siphons silted, gates seized, wheelhouses leaked. Every patch delayed the reckoning and deepened it. You see the template most brutally in the drains. Collector canals clogged, outfalls slumped. Without an exit, salt stayed and multiplied. Fields entered the curve, initial yield bump from water and fertilizer, then a sag as salinity crept, then an input race, more water to leach, more gypsum to amend, more diesel to lift. The loop called itself productivity while it strip mined soil. Then the borders changed and the pipes didn't. Post-1991, 5 new states inherited old hydraulics and social promises attached to them. A cotton gin employed a town, a power plant cooled on a loop, a canal fed a district that voted. The economic map said diversify, the water map said we owe people their taps and wages. Sunk costs hardened into politics. Governance muscle memory carried forward. Basin meetings sounded diplomatic and acted like quota reviews. Minimum flows became suggestions with exemptions. Data was power. Gauge readings were bargaining chips. The temporary compromise became the norm that managers trained their replacements to repeat. Unknown to those rooms, across town, a young agronomist kept notebooks like her grandfather's, soil texture, leaf burn dates, and watched the same patterns return in modern dress. Subsidies rearranged names, incentives stayed. When her district pushed area over efficiency, pumps ran at night and drains stopped at noon. A year later, the crop looked fine on harvest day and the soil died in winter. Here's where it gets uncomfortable. The template wasn't evil, it was effective at delivering on a narrow definition of success. It met textile targets, it electrified grids, it moved people into apartments with hot water. It also established a reflex to translate rivers into commitments that politics can't back away from easily. That reflex still lives in budget lines and procurement calendars. Now remember the hinge we're standing on. Climate shortens patience. New canals move faster than compacts. Portfolios chase corridors that assume gate timings will hold. The old Soviet habit, targets before mass balance, meets a thinner ice cap and hotter wind. The result isn't history repeating, it's history compressed. The fix starts where the habit formed: incentives. Pay for saved water, not sown hectares. Audit drains like heroes, not afterthoughts. Tie prestige to salinity bans and minimum flows that trigger automatically. Publish gauges at the fence, not just PDFs in an office. In other words, rewrite the command logic so the basin sits at the head of the table, not at the foot. Until then, every new trench is an old story told at speed. Climate squeeze, glaciers, monsoons, and the evaporation tax. To see why the basin's clock is speeding up, look uphill. The water tower is changing shape. Glaciers in the Pamirs and Tyne Shan are shrinking, and that flips the calendar twice. First comes the melt bonus, fatter shoulder flows for a few years that make intakes look smart and spreadsheets smug. Then the floor drops. Base flow thins as ice storage disappears. Rivers that once coasted through late summer now hesitate, and the hesitation arrives exactly when fields, grids, and cities ask for certainty. Timing is everything, and timing is slipping. Peak melt is arriving earlier. Sowing windows set for a cooler era don't move as easily as snowlands do. Early pulses brush past empty canals. Late in the season, a thinner trickle meets hotter air, wider canals, and longer reach, each meter a chance to lose water to the sky. What nobody modeled honestly was how a few weeks shift cascades, seed dates shoved, fertilizers mistimed, pumps running in daylight heat because the night release didn't come. The air itself has become a tax collector. Evaporation demand is up. The skin loss on reservoirs grows in hot, windy spells. A lake that once gave back predictably now throws water to dry gusts that skim it away. Canal seepage widens with age, then accelerates as thermal swings crack lining. Every hectare of surface area is a multiplier. Engineers trained to add capacity discover that capacity evaporates faster in a thinner century. Dust makes it worse. As beds go bare, delta pans, abandoned drains, even desiccated margins, their surfaces darken, albedo drops, sunlight sticks. Temperatures rise just enough to increase evaporation from the next pond, the next reach. The feedback is plain from space, darker patches spreading like spilled tea. On the ground, it's salt on lips after a wind, a grit against teeth in a breath you didn't want to take. Salinity creeps as stranded pools concentrate under sun and wind, and return flows carry that creep back to roots. Meanwhile, the sky's promises wobble. The monsoon's entrance and exit lines aren't polite anymore. Some years, storms bunch, episodes of heavy rain that swamp drains and scour fields when they should be inching seedlings along. Other years, rains split the difference, arriving as teasing showers that don't reach the soil profile. Flood, drought whiplash makes a mockery of allocation rules written for a softer climate. Averages don't help. Catastrophic weeks still decided. What nobody tells you in meetings is that storage has moods. Reservoirs designed for last century's hydrograph now juggle contradictory demands. Hold enough to cut a flood peak, keep enough to meet August's heat and power, release enough to keep salinity down in drains, and to keep cities from boiling under brownouts. A hot, windy week can lift evaporation past the model and steal the head from turbines just when fans and chillers spin hardest. Every adjustment at one gate shows up as stress 2 districts down. Upstream, the same squeeze has a different accent. High valleys thaw earlier. Active layers in alpine soils deepen, changing how slopes shed water and how wetlands breathe through summer. Springs that fed pastures shift or fade, pushing herders into tighter patterns. Landslides after sudden cloudbursts drop fine material into tributaries, which deliver it to mainstems that don't have the spare energy to push it through. Silt is destiny, arriving where intakes and bends pretend it won't. Downstream, the squeeze becomes a salinity ledger. Miss a flushing pulse and salts climb in shallow groundwater. Give in to the temptation to over-irrigate a hot week, and capillary rise brings brine to the root zone. A well that was merely brackish turns bitter, then useless. Each emergency save buys a month. It costs years of soil. Now map climate onto politics. Upstream storage becomes leverage precisely when transparency weakens. Drought declarations trigger clauses, late storms trigger blame. Without audited meters and shared dashboards, the sky writes excuses into governance. Qosh Tepa rides this weather, early melt makes the trench look generous, late season thinness makes its capture look like theft. A hot wind turns centimeters into scandal. There are pressure valves, but they trade time, not physics. Shade reservoirs where you can, line canals you can reach, retire the worst surfaces that do nothing but feed the sun. Shift crop calendars and cultivars to chase cooler hours and shorter seasons. Plant belts that blunt dust and raise albedo locally. Tie release rules to gauges that don't lie and make them automatic. None of that conjures water. It reduces the tax you pay for exposing it. Quiet truth is simple. The basin's bank account was ice. We're spending principal. The monsoon was the paycheck. It's becoming gig work, irregular, intense, unreliable, and the evaporation taxman never sleeps. In that math, speed is the enemy and attention is the tool. If we keep running the old play, promise more, store more, expose more, we'll accelerate the loss. If we slow where the sky punishes haste, we buy weeks that add up to seasons. In a thin century, seasons are wealth and survival. Basin wars by proxy, treaties, gaps, and upstream advantage. While that climate tax was being tallied in centimeters, the basin's rules were being written in pencil. The map still cited Soviet-era allocations, the 1990s Almaty arrangements that tried to keep the old plumbing honest after independence, but the legal backbone never reached Afghanistan. The Amu's biggest new claim sits outside the club. Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan manage headwaters for power. Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan manage plains for crops. Kazakhstan rides the downstream consequences. There's no sheriff with a badge big enough for all 5 plus Kabul. Upstream leverage isn't theoretical. Storage and diversions draw the first lines. Minimum flows without enforcement draw the last. A hot August makes agreements feel like suggestions. Gates hold a day longer than they should. A downstream canal drops 2 bricks on a weir to steal back centimeters. A district chief calls it an adjustment. Paper water absorbs the euphemism. Live water registers the loss. Data turns into currency. Gauge readings, reservoir levels, and intake rates should be just numbers. In dry years, they become bargaining chips. A station goes offline for maintenance right when a clause would trigger. A hydro plant publishes generation instead of release. A canal authority shares weekly means while farmers measure hours. Everyone sees enough to argue and too little to trust. Opacity buys time upstream and sells anxiety downstream. Case snapshots sketch the rhythm. In a thin year on the Sur, a planned release misses its window. Downstream, a district switches from cotton to wheat mid-rotation and eats the penalty. A week later, an emergency flush arrives, muddy, late, and laced with salts lifted off canal walls. In the Amu Delta, a fisheries cooperative closes nets for a season that never forms, then petitions for compensation nobody budgeted. At a border weir after midnight, valves turn with gloves over flashlights so no one has to write a report. Comparative precedents teach the bias. On the Mekong, upstream peaking reshaped tonal saps reversal, timing beat totals and fish paid first. On the Nile, the GERD reshuffled leverage. Storage upriver changed not just the amount but the schedule, forcing new playbooks in Khartoum and Cairo. In both basins, averages soothed microphones, while catastrophic weeks set prices and politics. Central Asia's rivers hum the same tune. Diplomacy tries, basin councils meet, joint communiques praise cooperation, working groups draft adaptive frameworks. The gaps are plain, no automatic triggers for drought, no audited shared meters, no penalties that hurt enough to matter, no seat reserved for Afghanistan with a binding vote. A treaty that ignores the trench is a courtesy, not a constraint. Meanwhile, upstream advantage compounds with infrastructure. Each new megawatt behind a high dam buys dispatchable power and a reason to hold water. Each new hectare under an intake buys a constituency that will push for late-season capture. Politics harden around concrete. A minister can't disappoint a grid, and a governor can't abandon a new canal bank without paying at the ballot box. The river becomes a schedule with too many masters. What nobody outside the room hears is the quiet contingency planning. Uzbekistan's agronomists expand pilots on drip and deficit irrigation. Turkmenistan's managers line priority reaches and let secondary canals age. Kazakhstan's water planners model for shortfalls because Amu stress will echo north via substitution. Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan sketch seasonal swaps, store winter water for summer megawatts, and sell timing for cash or gas. It all sounds tidy until a warm winter shaves snowpack and a hot June steals the cushion. Then there's the file marked Qosh Tepa. Without a basin seat, Afghanistan negotiates by shovel. Downstream ministries can express concern, upstream crews pour concrete. The best case is a rush to retrofit governance around a trench, audited meters at the intake, shared dashboards with hourly data, drought playbooks with pre-agreed cuts. The medium case is opacity and pilot seasons that become precedent. The worst is a thin year paired with a fast dig. In that pairing, the Delta's capillaries cross their last thresholds, and 1,000 quiet losses add up to a headline. Markets smell the gap. Offtake contracts add water clauses with real teeth. Project finance demands hydrology covenants, minimum flows, release windows, independent monitoring. Insurers price delay and non-delivery linked to gauges, not memos. Rating agencies add single basin risk to sovereign notes. It feels abstract until a Bond roadshow in London hinges on a graph from a station near Kirky. Transparency is the only cheap leverage left. Publish meters live and audited. Tie releases to gauges with auto-triggers. Map salinity bands as red lines with consequences. Pay upstream for timing as much as for volume. Fund drains the way we fund canals. Seat Afghanistan at a table with rules, not just complaints. Those are fixes that breathe. They don't add water, but they add trust, a resource that moves gates. Everything was about to change when the first basin tried it at scale. Because in a thin century, the only wars you can afford are the ones you prevent with numbers everyone can see. The $12 trillion exposure, food, energy, and the middle corridor. Start with a harvest that missed its week. A combine sat idle on the edge of a field near Corzum while the farmer stared at a message. Release postponed 72 hours. Wheat doesn't negotiate. Miss the soil's right feel by a few days and grain shrivels, protein slides, and the elevator's price sheet puts you in the penalty column. That's not a spreadsheet error. It's a river saying no. Across the district, picks and shovels replaced pumps for a day, then two. Then a buyer called from a rail spur asking why the tonnage was light. The answer was centimeters. Food rides those centimeters. Cotton demands steady duty cycles. Wheat asks for pulses that line up with root stages. A single dry week in June turns into a ginning line that runs short in October and a mill in Bursa that pays overtime to rework blends. A contract in Tashkent written in clean legalese now includes a meter ID at a specific gate. Miss that gauge's minimum for 5 days, and the buyer exercises the clause that cuts volumes and price. What nobody put on the brochure was that quality is water speaking through fiber strength and kernel weight. Energy wears the same dependence in steel and steam. Gas pipelines count on river-cooled compressor stations. Thermal plants count on intake temperatures that don't trigger fish kill limits. One hot August, a plant on the Zeravshan throttled output because the cooling loop ran sluggish in warm, low water. The grid filled the gap with diesel peakers, expensive noise that turned villages sleepless. The report called it a hydrology constraint. Workers called it the week the fans stopped. Hydro trades time for electrons. Reservoir head looks like comfort until evaporation skims your safety margin and silt steals a meter you assumed was permanent. Upstream, dispatchers are the evening peak and hold gates longer than the agreement likes. Downstream, pumps cough air at dawn. Power swaps that once read firm now carry footnotes tied to discharge at 2 stations most people can't pronounce. Invoices add a line for reservoir conditions. Nobody argues the physics. They argue the bill. Now track those pulses into the middle corridor. A week's shortfall on a river-fed terminal outside Kurik cascades into lighter barge drafts on the Caspian, delayed roll-ons at Aliat, and a Black Sea slot missed by 6 hours that turns into 6 days. A textile shipment aimed at Izmit arrives late. The buyer pushes your payment out a quarter. A container of spare parts bound for a mining line sits 2 berths back because the crane yard's cooling tower tripped and the union won't sweat through a heat advisory. Logistics doesn't call this drama. It calls it Tuesday when gauges blink. The corridor's promise always assumed water nodes would hum. In practice, every hinge point, port, yard, lock, intake listens to a river. When a drought advisory knocks Aktau's drafts down by 10 centimeters, operators shave stack heights, trains idle on sidings while manifests get reprinted. exporters pay the spread. Insurance underwriters update their loss models and ask for the hydrology dashboard credentials. If you can't show the page, they raise your premium before you finish the sentence. Here's where the number balloons. Food plus energy plus corridor flows, priced over a decade of capex and offtakes, equals exposure in the multi-trillion range. Not because one river sets global trade, but because a dozen small dependencies line up. A mill's procurement team hedges with extra stock, tying up cash. A power utility signs a backup gas contract it never wanted. A shipper pays for time charter flexibility. Each move shaves margin to buy certainty. Add the region's sovereigns, ports, pipelines, and grids, and the ledger reaches 12 zeros fast. It's not hype, it's cash pinned to gauges. Markets adapt in paperwork first. Offtakes introduce flex bands keyed to specific stations. Delivery windows float with drought triggers. Price curves include Central Asia hydrology basis. Banks write covenants that step interest if salinity at a drain exceeds thresholds for a month. Traders watch satellite pass imagery for reservoir glint and bid freight accordingly. A handful of centimeters decide whether a charterer exercises an option. Finance doesn't moralize, it quantifies. Meanwhile, manufacturers already feel it in throughput. A steel plant near Karabogas times quench cycles to river temperatures and pays a premium when intakes flirt with heat limits. A fertilizer line in Navoy slows ammonia output during a low-flow spell because cooling margins thin. Finished product misses a train window to Kars, sits under sun, and picks up a QA note that lowers the buyer's tolerance next quarter. Nobody blames climate in the memo. They write operational variance and move on. Unknown to most end customers, procurement teams turned amateur hydrologists. A food processor in Almaty added a column to its vendor scorecard, reliability under drought. A utilities board begins meetings with a slide of 4 gauges, not 4 fuel curves. A port authority ties executive bonuses to draft days maintained under heat. The story isn't doom, it's redesign. Then, because rivers also surprise, the corridor breathes in reverse. A wet spring flush drives salinity down, a rare cool summer grants reservoirs a reprieve, cranes catch up, spreads narrow, relief feels like competence. It is. It's weather being kind for a season. The exposure doesn't vanish in a rain, it waits. That's why the only real hedge is discipline written into things that move water and money. Live meters, auto triggers, drains that work, crops that forgive, intakes that don't pretend August behaves like May, and contracts that stop lying. Because the basin already set the speed limit, the corridor can either match it or pay for every time it tries to pass. Strategic emptiness too, why the map stayed thin. While contracts learned to breathe with gauges, the map kept a different rhythm. Space where you'd expect towns, silence where you'd expect protest. That wasn't an accident. Strategic emptiness near headworks and corridors turned out to be policy that solved 3 problems at once: approvals, security, and speed. Keep people thin where intakes sit and dams rise, and a permit moves faster than a petition. Fewer relocations, fewer kitchens to organize against a weir. Fewer eyes to film a midnight release. The doctrine evolved from an older logic. Soviet planners once drew belts of productive emptiness around big works, safety zones that doubled as control. After independence, the rationale shifted. Advisors called them buffers, flood envelopes, landslide setbacks. Sensible on paper, decisive in practice. A construction schedule breathes when it isn't dodging backyards. A corridor widens without lawsuits. The water wins time, the project wins silence. Governance learned to prefer clean lines over messy resilience. Put people in nodes where services can be stacked: hospital, school, market, substation, and the state can deliver, monitor, and message. Outside those nodes, leave pasture and scrub. In a drought, concentrate tankers, keep patrols simple, control rumors with 1 meeting instead of 20. In a flood, fewer evacuations, fewer buses on bad roads, fewer families to account for at a gate that may fail. Emptiness reads like prudence under hazard models and efficiency under budgets. Security loves the quiet too. A high dams approach road with no villages means fewer places for sabotage, fewer claims when checkpoints harden, fewer social escalations when a gate stays closed through a hard week. The same emptiness lets army convoys move without apology when a border flares. And in a basin where data is leverage, A sparse ring around headworks makes unwanted cameras rare. But emptiness carries a cost the ledger doesn't show. Opportunity clusters at junctions, rail, road, and river nodes, while hinterlands lose muscle. A child born in a buffer learns that power lives down the highway. Credit follows addresses, jobs follow badges, training follows unions. Meanwhile, resilience erodes where voices thin. Elders with headwater knowledge, the slope that slips after 3 hot days, the spring that recovers after 1 cold night, don't get a hearing because they don't get a seat. When a valve groans, the only witnesses are wind and dust. The paradox is sharpest at water's edge. Buffers keep settlements away from intakes, but they also blind the system to early warnings humans catch first. A farmer smells algae before a lab reports it. A child notices a bridge mark after school and tells a parent to hold planting 2 days. Replace those eyes with a camera on a mast and a monthly PDF, and you trade cheap attention for expensive surprises. Development repeats the pattern. A shiny logistics park blooms at a node with a ribbon and a headline. A clinic in the buffer closes, a teacher moves, a shop locks up. The corridor hums, the map thins. When drought hits, the node mobilizes, dashboards, meetings, thresholds. The buffer waits for a truck, and the truck waits for a phone call. Silence becomes policy's most dangerous success. There's a social psychology to emptiness that managers rarely name. People are easier to move later if they were never allowed to root. A family in a buffer learns not to plant trees that will outlive a permit. Houses stay modular. Rituals drift from riverbanks to parking lots. When relocation arrives, the grief is smaller by design, and so is the resistance. Stability is preserved by preventing attachment. Yet the basin's physics punishes overconfidence. Emptiness near headworks doesn't protect downstream capillaries. A canal starves a delta whether or not a buffer ringed its intake. A reservoir kept pristine by distance still loses a meter to wind. And when trust fails, the quiet areas become rumor factories. Every dry week is theft, every wet week a trick. Without communities embedded near the works, legitimacy has to be imported by press release. There's another path, slower and louder. Put small services back along the thin lines, co-op wells with public meters, microclinics tied to drought thresholds, schools that teach gauges as civics. Let buffers be smart, not hollow, seasonal grazing planned with spill risk, set back homes with buyout funds published in advance, community monitors paid to watch what machines miss. The map would stay thin where it must, but not mute. In a hotter, windier century, silence looks efficient until the false prosperity loop. Here's the mechanism nobody wants to admit out loud. In a hot week, you save a crop by pushing more water. The field looks rescued, the leaf curl eases, the inspector nods. Underfoot, a slower transaction starts. Over-irrigation lifts the shallow water table. Capillary rise pulls that water up through pores, bringing dissolved salts with it. The sun takes the water and leaves the salt. Root hairs meet a brine they can't name and begin to fail by millimeters. Drainage is the missing partner in every heroic season. Collectors silt, outfalls slump. The maintenance line in a budget loses to a ribbon cutting elsewhere. Without an exit, salt accumulates. Reuse turns efficient into corrosive. The same cubic meter that saved the cotton yesterday returns warmer and saltier today, then cycles again. Each pass concentrates. Each pass shrinks the margin between acceptable and fatal. Farmers learn to read the betrayal in small things. Soap won't lather in the courtyard. A white crust forms along a furrow's edge where water slows. Wheat heads look almost full from the road, then empty in the hand. Tomatoes glow and taste wrong. You throw more water because the supervisor visits next week, and a green field is a defense. The meter spins, the ledger applauds, physics keeps its own books. This is the false prosperity curve. First year after a new intake, yields jump. Inputs are fresh, soils flush, roots find air. Second year holds barely. Third year brings odd patches, sick corners, stubborn weeds, a strip along the tail end that refuses. Managers call variability, agronomists call warning. By year 5, the rescue budget, water, diesel, gypsum, eats the profit that the first bar chart promised you. Debt arrives disguised as optimization. Policy nudges the loop forward. Subsidies reward volume, not salinity balances. Area targets overpower drainage plans. Cheap water prices protect waste and punish care. Credit officers tour green, not drains. A farmer who cuts duty to save a soil horizon loses bonuses. A farmer who floods to pass inspection gets paid. Everyone sees the trap. Everyone rides it anyway. Meanwhile, drains demand the unglamorous work, cleaning collectors, lowering water tables, managing outfalls so that salts leave the root zone and don't return to canals. It's expensive, it's constant, and it's invisible when it succeeds. When it fails, the bill shows up in kidneys and kitchens first, then in procurement lines, then in migration. You can't photograph a working drain. You can photograph a white field. In markets, salinity is a quiet discount. Gins mark fiber that breaks, mills blend to hide weakness, buyers write off-spec with a shrug and cut the price. Wheat deliveries fall under protein thresholds by a hair, bakers compensate with additives, exporters widen spreads. None of those lines say salt, they say quality variance. Salt wrote the variance. Engineers try the kit, laser leveling to slow tailing losses, surge irrigation to reduce ponding, drip lines that feed roots and spare soil. Each helps, none erase the budget. Without drains, drip becomes a slow salting. Without salinity targets, leveling makes uniform the spread of a problem. Without rules that tie quotas to salt export, the kit is theater. Here's the line that wins or loses a decade. You can't leach without a place for salts to go, and you can't afford leaching water unless allocations recognize drains as infrastructure equal to canals. Pay for salt removed, not just water delivered. Publish S-maps like yield maps. Put bonuses on blue fields and penalties on the glittering ones. Make the heroic act in a dry week the decision to skip a save and protect a soil's future, and then pay for that courage. A micro-story says the rest. A farmer near Dashaguz stands at the edge of a plot that fed his family for 30 years. He rubs soil between his fingers and grimaces. His son shows him a brochure, drip, filters, promise. They install, and the first season looks good. The second season tastes of metal. The third ends with a bank visit. The brochure didn't include a drain. The trap isn't inevitable. It's incentivized. Reverse the reward and patience starts to pay. Retire the worst pans, build drains before intakes, price water to value soil, not just stems. Write seasons into law, salinity bans, automatic leaching windows, audited exits. The curve bends slowly. False prosperity fades. Real resilience looks boring. That's how you know it's working. Data wars and the dashboard lie. Meters don't lie, people do, mostly by omission. In a canal office near Urgench, a clerk logs intake volumes from a panel that hasn't been audited in 3 years. The pump curves look fine because the gauge is upstream of a leaky turnout. The field still dries out by Wednesday. On paper, delivery meets quota. On the ground, a farmer buys diesel he didn't budget for and blames the wind. Meter illusions thrive where alignment doesn't. An intake reading tells you what entered a canal, not what reached a route. Pumps hum, screens clog, tailenders watch headenders irrigate twice. A district report shows water applied, while fields at the end switch crops mid-season. When a contract asks for liters per hectare, the spreadsheet smiles. Plants negotiate in millimeters. Upstream, there's an incentive to keep it fuzzy. A canal's reputation rides on reliability, a ministry's on efficiency gains. Move the meter to flatter the narrative and salvage the KPI. A dashboard turns green even if the village text thread says, "Bring drums Thursday." Meanwhile, agencies merge, split, and rename, but the calibration sticker on the flow meter still says 2018. Orbit doesn't care about memos. Satellites watch heat plumes and reflectance. Evapotranspiration models pick out thirsty blocks field by field. Reservoir glint tells you surface area by week. NDVI catches crop stress 2 irrigations before a complaint letter reaches an office. A trader with an API key sees a drought arriving in a salinity spike long before a committee meets. The clash gets loud in drought. Seasonal means look normal. The catastrophic weeks are what matter. A canal authority posts within historical bands. A community scientist points to stick marks on bridge piers that say 2 days late and a salt ring where tomatoes died. Procurement needs windows, not averages. A factory manager who ordered inputs around a median timeline calls it what it is, a lie by smoothing. Community data rises because everyone's tired of arguing with PDFs. Pump hour logs in a notebook, tanker receipts clipped to a wall, WhatsApp photos of gauges at 6 a.m., a co-op paints big numbers on a pier and streams them with a cheap camera. Kids chart them for homework. The upstream agency calls it populism. The insurer calls it corroboration. Capital splits in two. One camp believes corporate dashboards with animated gauges and perfect fonts. The other trusts mixed sources, satellite ET anomalies, third-party audits, and co-op streams. The money follows credibility. A fund lowers premiums where a basin publishes raw feeds and accepts audits. It raises them where every answer arrives as a quarterly slide deck that never admits a miss. Insurers and banks rewire documents. Hydrology triggers move from annex to headline. Hit a minimum flow at station X for 7 days. Shipment windows slide without penalty. Salinity at drain why breaches are banned. Offtake volumes flex automatically. Lawyers stop asking, "What did you intend?" and start asking, "What does the meter show?" The only argument becomes which meter. This is where the dashboard lie breaks. A glossy portal that shows deliveries met can't coexist with satellite ET that says no. A GIF of reservoir fullness means nothing if wind and heat skins off 5 centimeters nobody counted. A canal that hides tail-end shortfalls in system efficiency finds its rating clipped by a model someone ran on a laptop 5 time zones away. The fix is boring and hard. Align meters to outcomes. Put audited sensors at intakes, mid-reaches, and farm turnouts. Publish raw and derived numbers. Timestamp every change. Let anyone compare dashboard lines with peer marks and orbit data. Tie bonuses to agreement between sources, not just to green lights. If NDVI says stress and the canal says flow, the incentive is to find the leak, not the narrative. One more pivot: teach hydrology as civics. Put gauges where teenagers can see them, deadlines where clerks can't hide them, and consequence where excuses used to sit. The basin doesn't need perfect data, it needs trusted data that moves valves. Because every day without it, someone trades a field for a tank, a schedule for a rumor, and a season for a screen that said all good while the soil glittered. Possible pressure valves, efficiency, crops, and managed retreat. Here's where it gets practical. You can't print water, but you can spend less of it to buy time. Hardware goes first. Line the worst leaking reaches, not the pretty stretches near the highway. Audit every turnout. Fix the head-end bloat that starves tail-enders by midweek. Surge valves and gated pipes beat open furrows in a hot century. Laser leveling shrinks ponding, and night irrigation cuts the evaporation tax when the wind lies down. Drip and low-pressure sprinklers help, but only if the salt has somewhere to go. Pair them with drains, or you build a quiet brine factory at the root zone. Pressure regulation is a silent hero. Half the efficiency loss is overpressured pumps beating water into sand. Fit variable speed drives, train crews to read manometers, not just full-on. Leak hunts aren't a campaign, they're a habit. Pay districts for cubic meters saved at the farm gate, not delivered at the intake. Publish the savings and split the gain: diesel spared, hours recovered, centimeters left in the river. But efficiency without agronomy is cosmetics. Crop choice is a water plan wearing boots. Retire cotton on the saltiest pans, put cereals and pulses where forgiveness matters. Move to shorter season cultivars that chase cool hours and avoid August's teeth. Seed earlier when melt advances. Shift sowing bands by microclimate, not district boundaries. Rotational fallowing isn't a failure if the fallow is strategic. Stagger it across subreaches so a canal can breathe without starving a town. Salt-tolerant lines aren't silver bullets, but they push thresholds. Barley where wheat falters, halophyte forages where alfalfa dies. Gypsum helps where sedicity locks soil. Organic matter buys porosity that salt can't easily conquer. Trial plots should sit at tail ends, not research stations. Pay farmers to risk the first season and keep the seeds that prove they can take a hot wind. Release rules need lungs. Write rules that breathe into law. Priority tiers that switch automatically under gauges. Drought triggers that ratchet flows to drinking water and baseline food. Then peel back exports without a midnight argument. Make minimum flows real. Audited meters and auto penalties that hurt. Tie canal openings to salinity bands in drains. If S climbs, the leaching window opens even when the schedule hates it. The basin will always prefer a valve that moves itself to a meeting that arrives too late. Aquifers aren't a piggy bank, they're a lifeline with rules. Cap withdrawals by basin, not by pump. Map salinity and right zones, what can be pulled where, and when you must replenish. Managed aquifer recharge can turn a flood into a bank deposit. Spread water across sandy fans after storms. Feed recharge basins off canal slack in May instead of dumping to a drain. Build small recharge ponds against villages with meters on both ends. Publish the balance like a bank statement. Liters stored, liters withdrawn, triggers that stop the pump when the line goes red. All of that sounds like policy. It's also a social contract. People don't swap crops or skip irrigations on faith. Compensation must clear fast, not next quarter. Pay households to accept cuts that save a basin, cash for yield loss, vouchers for efficient kit, guarantees that tanker queues shrink when thresholds hit. Promise baseline water per person and make it visible. Meters at the fence, dashboards in the clinic, text alerts in Uzbek, Turkmen, Karakalpak, Kyrgyz, Tajik, and Dari. If you ask for trust, show your numbers. Community monitoring isn't a slogan, it's leverage. Train co-ops to log pump hours, sample drains, and stream gauge heights. Give them a number to call when a valve misses its mark, and the authority to trigger a rule. Put youth on stipend to read peer marks and match them against the dashboard. If the data disagrees, the default is protection. Flows ratchet down, drains open, audits start. Managed retreat is the line nobody wants to write. Retire the deadest fields with honor. Buy out plots that glitter white 3 Julys in a row. Move people once, not thrice, and move them better. Houses where jobs live, clinics tied to drought cycles, schools that teach the gauges their parents used to ignore. Fund exits with green bonds keyed to hydrology triggers. When a drain hits target salinity for a season, coupon steps down. When a canal keeps minimum flows through August, premium tightens. Finance will follow clear rules faster than it'll heed speeches. This is time bartering, not magic. Every retrofit trades exposure for resilience. Every crop shift trades romance for survival. Every retreat trades pride for permanence. Do it before a crisis and you choose your pace. Do it after and the river chooses for you. In a thin century, the pressure valves that work are the ones you can see, measure, and enforce in heat, not the ones you admire in a plan. The Qosh Tepa decision tree, best worst case paths. Lay the map on the table and pick a fork. The canal exists. The only question left is whether governance will catch it, measure it, and bind it, or whether the trench writes the rules by flowing first. Best case starts small and fastens itself to meters. Kabul phases intake in steps tied to audited gauges at the head and along the mainline. Every new reach opens only after flow losses are measured, seepage lined where needed, and salinity at designated drains downstream stays within bands for a full season. A trilateral team, Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, with an independent auditor publishes hourly data, intake rate, losses by reach, return flows, and drain salinity. Release windows are harmonized with downstream sowing, and intake throttles automatically during late-season low flow. Emergency drought playbooks sit pre-signed. A flow floor at Kirki triggers a staged cut at Qosh Tepa within hours, not weeks. On farms, pilot plots lead, not rhetoric. Drip and gated pipes arrive with filters and maintenance budgets, not just brochures. Crop mixes lean towards cereals and short-season staples that forgive thin pulses. A joint silt plan keeps the intake alive, sluice cycles, settling basins, and a sediment budget that doesn't pretend the Amu is clean. Politics frames the project as stability, not conquest. A fund flows upstream, cash for measured restraint and efficiency, not lump sum promises, paid by lower insurance premiums and cheaper capital downstream because markets trust gauges more than pressers. Outcome: new hectares within hydrologic limits, a flatter volatility curve, and fewer midnight valves. Downstream salinity rises less, drains keep pace, and the delta's capillaries survive another thin century's shove. Bonds price softer. Offtakes write smaller flex bands. A corridor breathes. Medium case blurs the edges. Afghanistan builds in big bites. Meters exist, but calibration slips. Audits are seasonal and political calendars crowd technical ones. Some intake lining, some field efficiency, patchy training. Joint scheduling exists on paper, but drought triggers wobble under pressure. Farmers see creeping salinity, pumps multiply. Downstream, releases come late and muddy more often. Canal managers develop the habit of temporary rationing. Crop switches appear mid-rotation. Gins run short 1 year, mills the next. Insurance rides herd with higher deductibles. Lenders add hydrology covenants that bite on bad weeks. Conflicts stay local, gate disputes, night pumping, border weir theatrics, without tipping into crisis. Everyone pays the anxiety tax in diesel, discounts, and missed windows. The map holds thinner. Worst case moves at speed and hides the meters. Intake jumps from pilot to mainline in a season. Silt management is an afterthought. Seepage blooms. Return flows are warmer, saltier, later, or absent. No binding minimum flows, no auto-triggers, and a hot August pairs with an early thin melt. Downstream, canals invert, backflows where heads should be. Delta capillaries cross thresholds. Fisheries shutter. Emergency rations replace procurement. Clinics add dust and kidney wards. Wind days multiply on school boards. Border meetings turn brittle, valves turn in the dark. Press offices translate absence into euphemism. Capital notices of F takes invoke hydrology force majeure. Ratings mention basin governance failure. Spreads widen. A corridor stutters, draft cuts. Crane hours lost to heat. Inventory buffers that eat cash. Reputations break faster than contracts. Decision gates can still tilt the path. Gate 1, meter auditability. Not just devices, but third-party calibration, tamper seals, redundancy, and mirrored data streams public by default. Gate 2, treaty addenda with teeth. Afghanistan seated in a compact that defines minimum flows by station and schedules with auto-cut logic, plus compensation formulas that pay for restraint. Gate 3, harmonized release windows upstream and intake throttling upstream of the intake. Grid operators at Toktagul and Nurek at the same table as canal managers and agronomists, with drought scripts rehearsed. Gate 4, emergency playbooks, pre-agreed priority tiers, tanker routes, and buyout funds for the deadest fields, triggered by gauges, not speeches. Who pays and when is relentless. Farmers first, yield sag, quality discounts, more diesel per ton, and debt dressed as pumps. Then ports and processors, throughput loss, overtime to chase windows, power curtailments during heat, QA downgrades. Then bondholders, rating outlooks shaded by centimeters, covenant step-ups when salinity breaches for weeks, and sovereign spreads that whisper water. Upstream too, if meters lie, capital prices it. If they speak, money softens. The choice isn't romantic. It's plumbing and paperwork. Phase intake with data, start small, learn, then add gates. Bind the trench to the basin with rules that breathe and dashboards that don't. Pay for time-saving drains, not just water-moving canals. Compensate cuts before resentment calcifies. Seat Afghanistan or negotiate by drought, because the canal will teach physics either way. The only decision that matters is whether we learn water leverage, external players, and quiet bets. Money arrived with conditions long before ministers admitted the river was a counterparty. A development bank sent a team with clipboards and clauses. We'll fund lining and modern intakes, but meters first, public dashboards second, drought triggers third. A Gulf fund offered cash for a logistics park and a quiet addendum, rights to see reservoir data in real time. A European agency pitched resilience bonds keyed to minimum flows. Each line looked technical. Each line bought leverage at a gate. Influence maps redrew the basin without borders. A port equity stake in Aktau tied to a power swap deal in the Zeravshan Valley, itself contingent on a reservoir operating curve. A consortium bidding on cranes at Aliat paired its offer with a service contract on canal pumps 2 countries east. A fiber link along a rail spur came with a side agreement for telemetry from weirs. Data access wasn't charity, it was a seat in the control room without the politics of a flag. Contracts evolved faster than the compact. Offtakes began to hum in hydrology, volume bands flex with the gauge at Kirky, penalties vanish if salinity at drain 14 stays under a line, delivery windows move with a published drought index. A steel mill agreed to pay more in wet years to guarantee minimums in dry ones. A textile buyer dropped cotton tonnage unless audited tail-end deliveries met a threshold. Paper traded certainty, and certainty now spoke in centimeters and micro-Siemens. Hedging got practical. A grain house split origin, half Corzum, half farther north, with a clause that swapped shipments if the Amu blinked. A utility stacked electrons, some hydro, some gas, some imported, then added storage near heat-prone nodes to ride thin weeks. A shipper routed a third of containers overland only if Caspian drafts held above a mark for 10 consecutive days. Inventory became policy, warehouses turned into dams for goods. External players learned to bet on character as much as concrete. "Show me your water P&L," a fund manager said in an office with no windows. The best operators pulled up dashboards that looked like bank apps: liters in, liters recycled, liters to drains, lens levels versus triggers, all time-stamped. Premiums narrowed. Insurance smiled. The next company opened a slide deck with aspirational arrows and a photo of a shiny valve. The room went quiet. Capital doesn't fall for poetry twice. Storytelling joined strategy. Governments framed scarcity as managed stability, not crisis. Gauges on the fence, co-ops reading peer marks, auto-triggered cuts that felt boring. Credibility beat ambition. A minister announced a drought playbook signed by 5 agencies and 3 utilities, with a public rehearsal date and a hotline for breaches. A week later, a lender shaved 40 basis points off a bond tied to that plan. Markets don't need guarantees, they need believable rules. Not every bet was quiet. A northern neighbor warned that a fast Afghan intake could shift Amu flows materially. Another argued for corridors that reduced exposure. Rail and ports hardened against heat, power redundancy for crane yards, extra draft margins. Papers got written, cameras rolled. Behind them, people drew term sheets. A Central Asian sovereign set a cap on basin exposure in its industrial policy. No single river can underwrite more than 30% of any new cluster's risk. It sounded academic. It steered billions. There were misreads. A dazzling smart canal proposal promised AI allocation without drains and meters. The pilot ran a season and died in salt. A high-gloss desalination pitch tried to sell Gulf tech to an inland plain. The cost curve laughed. A hedge fund went long on cotton based on wet year yields and forgot the curve called salinity. Exit signs flashed by harvest. Still, a pattern held. Capital flowed fastest where constraints were acknowledged and enforced. Investors began to ask a simple question at diligence. When the gauge dips, who gets to say stop, and does the valve listen? If the answer was "we'll meet and discuss," the money priced delay. If the answer was a trigger with a camera on it, the money moved. This is how water leverage looks in a thin century, less about grand dams than about who reads the meter and who pays when it lies. External players won't save a basin. They'll reward the people who treat it like a partner, not a promise. Quiet bets, loud rules, and a river that finally gets a vote in every contract. Exit ramps and their costs, portfolio thinking for a basin. Start with the crop book. Rebalance it like a fund. Less cotton on the saltiest pans, more resilient staples where forgiveness lives, value add only where water elasticity is lowest. You won't win headlines, you'll win seasons. Storage that behaves means distributed, flexible pieces. Off-channel ponds, shaded cells, micro-reservoirs fed by storm pulses. So one hot wind doesn't skim your whole bet. Mega builds still matter, but not as single points of failure. Demand discipline is cheapest water found. Urban leak hunts, industrial reuse as code, tiered tariffs that protect lifeline use and charge for waste. Tie permits to return flow neutrality and summer operations that don't cook rivers. Compacts that counter data first. Shared dashboards, pooled drought reserves, auto-triggers across borders. Finance that enforces follows. Green bonds keyed to gauges, coupon step-downs for compliance, penalties for dashboard lies. Time is the currency. Spend it where returns survive heat. Drains before canals, rules before ribbon cuttings, meters before promises. The human ledger, what survival looks like on the ground. Before any treaty, a household makes a plan. In a courtyard outside Nucas, a co-op well hums to life when the sun clears a neighbor's roof. A sensor on the head flashes green. The number on a fence-mounted display climbs in centimeters. It's not pretty metal box, dusty cables, but everyone on the lane can see it. The rule is simple: 3 jerrycans per household before noon on drought days, 5 when the gauge at the bridge holds. A teenager chalks today's allocation on a wall and snaps a photo for the group chat. You don't need trust when the meter sits at eye level. Down the road, the school year bends to the river's breath. The principal keeps 2 calendars, lessons in blue, water days in red. When a drought trigger hits, message tone, a number on the pier, classes end at noon so kids can help with collection. Teachers swap algebra for field math, reading stick marks, logging pump hours, noting wind that raises evaporation. A civics lesson is a valve that moved when a threshold tripped. It sounds small until a summer like last year, when the early melt skipped the sowing window and the town saved 2 planting cycles by shifting an entire week because the gauge said so. In the clinic, drought looks like logistics. Shelves hold saline, antibiotics, and inhalers stacked to thresholds tied to the same river numbers. A laminated card by the nurse's desk lists triggers. If drain 5 salinity climbs, double respiratory stock. If the intake drops below line 3 on the pier, activate home visit rounds for elders. The power cut protocol sits under that, ice blocks pre-frozen in a chest, a backup solar pump that keeps vaccine fridges within range, a generator rationed by hours, not hope. The clinic's flowchart is calmer than the sky. Co-ops fill in the cracks. A shed beside a canal stores spools of drip tape, spare emitters, filter housings, and gaskets. A notebook on a nail lists who borrowed what and when. A phone number on the wall calls the kid who learned to fix a pump seal by watching videos and breaking 3 before he got it right. Next door, a seed cabinet keeps drought-tolerant barley and short-season wheat in jars, labeled with seasons and fields where they worked. If you want to borrow, you bring a handful back after harvest and a note on salinity, tail end, head end, crust, or no crust. Managed movement is the part nobody wants to name, but everybody plans. In a village south of Urgench, a board by the bus stop shows the schedule for seasonal work corridors, departure dates, dormitory addresses, job types, rights. A liaison in the city checks contracts and photographs housing before people leave. There's a WhatsApp group for grievance escalation, late pay, bad water, broken promises. Buses take families together when they can. Children enroll in host schools for a trimester, not weeks, and bring their homework back on lanes where the co-op well keeps the lights on. Migration stops being a scramble and becomes a commute. Culture learns meters too. A riverside ritual once tied to spring flood now meets under canopy by the community gauge. Elders tell stories in the shade, then walk to the pier and mark the line. The prayer folds in a sentence about patience under heat. Weddings shift to cooler hours. Funerals include a donation to the drain cleaning crew. You can feel the change in how people talk. Fewer rumors, more references to numbers. We'll plant when the bridge shows the second ring, one farmer says. Not when a cousin's cousin hears a gate is opening. Then there's the household ledger. A woman in Dashigas keeps 3 columns in a notebook: diesel saved by night irrigation, liters per tree under drip, and days the co-op well's pressure dropped below the mark. When the district office announces a pilot, she walks in with pages, dates, flows, outcomes, and asks for tape and filters, not slogans. She gets them because her data fits the dashboard and the clerk wants a smooth audit. Bureaucracy becomes a trading post, numbers for kit, behavior for buffer. Resilience looks like boring repetition. The drain cleaning crew leaves at dawn with shovels and a thermos, clears silt, sends photos of outfalls that actually flow. A kid on stipend bikes between 3 gauges, live streaming each one. A co-op treasurer pays a retired welder to fix a cracked head on the community pump before it becomes a crisis. In the evenings, someone checks the clinic's generator fuel and the freezer's ice blocks with the same care an elder once gave a canal gate. Not every story lands neat. A farmer retires a dead field and cries anyway. A family sells a cow to buy a filter. A teacher leaves because the city pays better. But the ratio shifts. More choices made, fewer choices forced. In a year with an early pulse and a hot August, this town missed 2 disasters because the meter moved the meeting instead of the rumor. The hinge is visibility. Put the numbers where people live and give them a path to act when the numbers turn. Rights get teeth. A baseline allocation per person, a threshold that triggers tanker routes, a phone that rings in an office when a valve stays closed, and a rule that moves money when a field goes white 3 years in a row. The state keeps its promise of service where it can stack it. The village keeps its promise of care where it can see it. What survival looks like on the ground isn't heroic. It's a fence meter, a school bell tied to a gauge, a clinic fridge that stays cold through a brownout, a bus on time, a seed jar labeled honest. It's culture that stops pretending the river owes it a schedule and starts writing one that respects the river's mood. It's patience as policy, and it works 1 centimeter at a time. The meaning: why Central Asia is going silent. Silence feels like retreat, but here it's a strategy. Near headworks and along the big canals, emptiness lowers the friction that slows permits, complicates patrols, and sparks protest when a valve doesn't turn. It's sold as safety, flood envelopes, landslide setbacks, hazard zones. It functions as control. With fewer people at the intake, fewer eyes see a missed window or a midnight release. The map thins to make the machine run. Silence also arrives as loss. When water leaves, voices follow. A family that once timed life to a river's pulse moves to a node because the clinic, the school, and the tanker all sit there now. Rituals drift from banks to courtyards. The story keepers who knew the slope that slips after 3 hot days go unheard because the buffer never had a council seat. A meter on a fence can replace rumor, but it can't replace belonging. You feel it in a lane that used to hum at dusk and now holds only wind. The lie beneath the maps was always abundance equals supply. On paper, blue looked infinite. In the field, live water keeps its own schedule, peaks that don't match planting, pulses that don't line up with cooling towers, weeks that decide contracts while annual averages soothe microphones. Targets turned rivers into quotas, dashboards turned misses into smoothing. The land kept a truer ledger: salt rings, dusty nets, fans that stopped in August. The basin's pivot isn't romantic. Prosperity that fits the gauge means drains before canals, rights tied to meters, crops that forgive heat, and rules that move valves automatically when thresholds hit. It means paying for restraint as much as for flow, writing treaties with teeth that include the trench everyone sees, and letting community data sit beside satellites and ministries. That's rigor. It costs in headlines and tempo, not in futures. Silence as policy will persist near concrete. Empty rings around headworks simplify risk. The choice is whether those rings stay mute or become smart. Grazing planned around spill curves, setback homes with buyout funds published up front, co-op wells with public meters, microclinics stocked by river thresholds. Thin doesn't have to mean blind. In a hotter, windier century, attention is cheaper than aftermath. There's a deeper reckoning here. The region inherited pipes and promises that ignored the capillaries. The Aral didn't vanish by accident. It was scheduled away by targets that paid on stems, not on salinity. Qosh Tepa won't be different because it's new. It'll be different only if meters govern ambition and drains keep pace with intakes. The silence around it, approvals swift, objections distant, won't save anyone downstream from physics. Markets already translated the lesson. Contracts breathe with gauges, ratings mention rivers, insurers ask for dashboard logins. That's not punishment. It's discipline the climate would have imposed anyway. The only thing worse than being priced by a river is being surprised by one. In that sense, the quiet numbers on a pier are the opposite of silence. They're the basin speaking clearly. What matters now is who chooses the discomfort of honesty. Ministers who accept smaller seasonal targets in exchange for durable lungs, engineers who put drains on the ribbon, lenders who cut coupons when flows hold, co-ops that read meters before meetings, and a trench that earns a seat by agreeing to rules it can't break without everyone seeing it. None of that adds water. It adds trust. Gates move when trust moves them. Why Central Asia is going silent is simple and sharp. Part of it is design, buffers to keep projects clean and guards unburdened. Part of it is failure, soils that glitter, deltas that thin, livelihoods that follow tanker schedules instead of rivers. The meaning sits in what fills the quiet. If it's secrecy, the basin hardens, then breaks. If it's visible gauges, boring enforcement, and communities that can act on numbers, the silence becomes space for a different kind of voice, patient, precise, and stubborn enough to match the river's mood. The basin already told everyone how fast it wants to move. The people who prosper here will be the ones who learn to speak at that speed. The basin decides the timeline. Markets and ministries only get memos. If you want to see how this governance baggage rewrites treaties and keeps corridors alive through drought, watch the follow-up. Subscribe for maps that measure truth, and for the people turning dashboards into rules that move valves, not speeches.